Hello again, I am Watty. So, hey, what do you reckon the state of VR MMOs is like these days? Well, today I thought I might take a poke at those and see what's up, see where we're at, and where we're headed, hopefully. I mean, at first blush, you'd think VR MMOs would be just the absolute most awesome way to do an MMO, right? To get so much more immersed in these large, complex, open-ranging worlds that are designed to be soaked into for hours upon hours at a time across the span of years of gameplay. But there's one huge problem that might simply doom every single attempt at making a meaningful VR MMO game for the foreseeable future. But I'll come back to that at the end. I don't want to start with doom and gloom, we'll get there. But while we're getting there, pop your best guess into the comment section down below as to what you think the biggest failure point of every VR MMO game just might be. So, while covering Blue Protocol recently, an anime-styled MMORPG with a high fantasy setting, it's tough not for me to think about related media, like the extremely popular anime series Sword Art Online. And in fact, digging into Blue Protocol over the last couple of weeks has led me into starting a rewatch of Sword Art Online, and it's pretty good if you've not seen it yet. And while it's a long way from being the only, or even the first anime that takes the isekai trope, or Lost in Another World concept, and applies it to an MMO, it is one of the most recognized ones in that subslice of that genre. Pretty much in any discussion about VR MMOs, someone's going to mention SAO. But of course, the thing that makes the isekai trope even work in an MMO concept is you need some kind of fully immersive VR system. In the case of SAO, it was called the Nerve Gear, later replaced in the series with a system called Amusphere. In concept, it basically shuts off all your external sensory inputs and replaces them with artificially generated stuff from the game, and then it just gets beamed right into your brain with microwaves. Now, obviously, we're a long way from that, and I don't think microwaves are the most practical way to do that, just scientifically speaking, and I'm not really sure we would want that kind of technology shutting us down as meat slabs and puppeteering our brainwaves directly from external sources generated elsewhere, as a couple of the storylines from SAO do a pretty good job of exploring the horrifying dangers of. However, in the real world, consumer-friendly VR has been very slowly trying to mature for the best part of the last decade, and with the PSVR 2 now being the newest entry into that effort, and it being fairly warmly received by reviewers, although I have my doubts about how well it'll actually sell, it will at least give VR titles another shove into the consumer spotlight for a while, and along with that, VR MMOs. So what is actually the state of real VR MMOs right now? Well, sorry to burst your bubble before we even get our feet wet here, but spoiler alert, they're all kind of janky looking, and not one of them has an actual functionally large user base. Now, of course, this isn't an exhaustive list, but I've chosen a few of the more interesting and prime and promising examples that seem to have a decent amount of effort put behind them. So let's start with Zenith, The Last City. The devs are describing it as the ultimate VR MMORPG experience. Drawing inspiration from a variety of JRPGs and MMOs, Zenith has taken the VR gaming world by storm, becoming a top-selling game since its 2022 launch. So a couple of things about that. It hasn't actually launched at all. That's just a lie. It is in fact still in early access and in active development. They're not done doing it yet, with the most recent patches being in December last year and the first week of February. They're also charging 42 Aussie beer purchasing tokens for it, which for an early access VR MMO game, yeah, not something I've been able to justify pulling the trigger on to see for myself how it actually plays. But the trailers do make it look pretty good, don't they? Bright, dynamic, action-filled. However, the devs claiming it took the VR gaming world by storm, that's just another lie. Because I checked, and it has a player base that sits deep in the middle of double-digit territory and is consistently bleeding players week to week. And even its day one peak was 4,500 players, which not exactly bragging numbers for an MMO. I'm not sure what kind of storm the devs were thinking of. Perhaps it's the proverbial one from the teacup. But the reviews do seem pretty positive, although Steam reviews are always a bit of a crapshoot, aren't they? And of course, there's more than one of them comparing it to Sword Art Online, as, like I said, SAO was a smash hit anime and has kind of become the imagined de facto default for thematic goals for people when it comes to immersive VR MMO stuff. But then other people in the reviews compare the combat to feeling like flailing around with a Nintendo Wii controller and the old waggle mechanics of some of its games. And that is one of the bigger issues with VR as it stands, especially this style of combat in VR. While most current VR systems have controllers with at least basic vibration, haptic feedback and whatnot, you're still just swinging small controllers through the air. Controllers designed to be light, for the sake of comfort of course, so there's never any sense of weight to weapon. There's no feeling of impact. There's no sense of inertia at all. And some VR enthusiasts will build, buy, or 3D print or whatever snap-on accessories for the controllers to help with this, especially for rifle and pistol-style things for shooters. And that can indeed help quite a lot with the feeling of immersion. But in an MMO full of swords and shields and bows and hammers and the like, there's just not much you can do about that in a practical sense. Moving on to Orbis VR Reborn. Now, I personally tried Orbis when it first came out in 2019. It used to have a free demo, which was smart for such a new game type on this kind of platform. Because see, even just 4 years back, true VR MMOs were basically non-existent, and Orbis was one of, if not the first, to give it an earnest go. It wasn't a mod for something else, it wasn't adapted, it was designed for virtual reality from the ground up, and it had full room scale ability. The basic mechanical concepts of the game are all pretty bog-standard RPG fare. The idea wasn't to break new ground there, it was just to see how well this stuff can work in VR. So you've got 8 player classes, dynamic difficulty scaling, group finders, pets, and crafting and fishing, and player trading, and group dungeons and raids, and even PvP and public events. Now, back when I played it didn't really have all of that stuff. It was very early on in the game, and it was before their so-called Reborn update, which revamped the entire game from mechanics to graphical presentation. And somewhere along the way, they also got rid of the free demo, which seems dumb. However, for all of the obvious work they've put into this game, as an MMO, it has failed pretty big. The average player count is single digits, and the all-time peak player count was just 337 players, and that was 2 days after the beta launch 5 years ago. And that was mostly people just like me, very curious about it, because at the time it was, kind of a one-of-a-kind thing. It was a pioneer. We were curious. Obviously, it did not manage to hang on to all of us, or any of us, really. The next one I want to show you is yet to be released, but we might consider it perhaps the Generation 2 of trying to do VR MMO. Elysia are claiming to be the first true MMORPG built for VR. And I'm not entirely clear on what standards or measure by which they are making that claim, because, well, for my money, that particular accolade is more fairly claimed by Orbis VR, because I played that 5 years ago. But whatever, copywriters for game devs are very frequently completely full of shit, so shrug, moving on. Their goals seem pretty ambitious, promising a checklist full of all the wants, in-depth classes and skill systems, dynamic weather systems, climbing and gliding and swimming, and huge titanic enemies, dungeons and raids, and opt-in PvP, rideable mounts including flying mounts, player housing, crafting, pets, and both melee, ranged, and magic combat systems. And looking at their preview trailers on Steam, some of it looks pretty janky, but to be fair, VR often does look unusually janky from the outside looking in, watching someone else's gameplay, but it also seems especially flat looking. It doesn't have any shadowing or dynamic lighting systems and the like in play. But then most MMO games are usually a bit old looking by comparison to their contemporaries. It's a compromise to try and make sure the player base is as wide as possible, because obviously MMOs rely heavily on having large and active player bases, so making sure even mild potato PCs can run them is pretty important for that particular genre of game. But with VR, to even run VR, you've got to have a decent middle-of-the-road system anyway, and I feel like the extra attention to presentation should be a higher priority, because just by nature of VR, immersion has a higher tier factor of importance, doesn't it? But presentation aside, Elysia is sitting on my wish list and has been for a little while now. I'm keeping an eye on it. It seems it might be very, very interesting, but Now, here we go. Here's the doom part. I've spoken about the immersion issues. First, with the floaty, weightless feel of VR controllers, and secondly, with the more limited graphical approaches that have to be taken, just thanks to VR being inherently more demanding than a flat-screen game is to render, because, you're basically got to generate every scene and every frame of every scene twice, once for each eye, because, well, that's how depth perception works, and without that, VR doesn't really work. But the immersion is one thing. Here is the big issue, the killer issue. MMOs are, by design, made to be long play games. People play them for hours upon hours upon hours at a time, at least a few times a week, and for many, they do it every single day. And that's great. They're designed for this. Large chunks of the content tend to be pretty chill stuff, brain off kind of stuff, so you can just potter about in the game world, farming XP by grinding around, open world mobs, or collecting crafting materials, leveling up your various skills like cooking or farming or fishing or, wood chopping or whatever. Probably you're doing this while shooting the shit with your guildmates over voice chat, or maybe just chilling solo and watching some Simpsons on the second screen. And then maybe on weekends when everybody has more free time, you'll group up and do more active, attention-intensive stuff like a few dungeon runs, maybe a raid or a war. Now, think about that kind of gameplay loop in VR. In the case of the games I've spoken about already, they're best played standing up so you can swing your weapons around freely. So, you're standing in the middle of your room, you're swinging your arms around, you're isolated from any secondary screens and the like for hours and hours? I can't see many people finding that as fun, or indeed relaxing, as the typical flat-screen MMO experience as we've known it for the last couple of decades of gaming tends to be. So how about this? Maybe you only stand for the intensive stuff, like the dungeons and the raids. Sure, fine. For the rest, you sit down and you compromise on how freely you can swing your arms. But that also does mean you're sitting there, VR headset blinding you to everything around you, hands resting on the arms of your chair, lifting them up every now and again to, swing at a rock for mining or something. And you're sitting there, you're doing the low-key stuff. You're mining that ore, you're chopping those trees, you're picking plants, you're doing a bit of farming. Maybe you're killing a few boar so you can skill them for your leatherworking skill. Sure, that kind of stuff won't tire out your feet, your legs, your back, or even your arms doing that for hours at a time, really. But that's also the kind of stuff you'd normally do while you've got other distractions going on, because it's not that interesting just to focus on exclusively, is it? Take New World, for example. I once spent 5 hours straight doing nothing but chopping down trees. 5 hours of just chopping tree after tree after tree after tree after tree. I was just leveling up my lumberjacking and woodcrafting skills and whatnot. And I was never once bored. I never once found that tedious, because while I was doing that with 5% of my brain on, I was second screening other, more interesting stuff that I could focus on, that could keep my attention, that could give me a reason to stay sitting in that chair chopping trees down for hours and hours and hours and hours. And you can't do that effectively in VR. I mean, there is a way to kind of do that. There are third-party programs that can be used to project floating screens from your PC's desktop into VR, which is how I and many other people who've streamed VR stuff before can actually see Twitch chat windows when we stream VR. But I still don't see many people going in for a real, proper, full-fat, traditional MMO-type game in VR because of these issues. In theory, it sounds amazing. In practicality, not so much. VR is awesome for many game types. It really kicks them up the arse. Quick burst shooters, racing games, flight sims, and social spaces like VR chat even. The immersion on offer really boosts those games up another notch. But again, while in theory, an immersive VR MMO sounds ideal, getting lost in these fantasy worlds, just soaked into them in 3D, you're inside them, you're experiencing them in an immersive way. With current tech and current interfaces, I just don't see it taking off in any meaningful way when it comes to the gameplay side of things. I've been wondering if a hybrid VR MMO would work. So you've got the VR headset on, so you've got the visual immersiveness of it, the audio immersiveness of it. But you've got a more passive control scheme using a controller. So you're sitting back, lying back on your chair or whatever. You've just got the controller sitting in your lap. Your arms and your shoulders are relaxed. You could play seated like that for extended periods without compromise or awkwardness. But how much compromise does that make to the point of playing an MMO in VR? Ideally, of course, a Sword Art Online style rig, where you're, well, more or less in an active dream state, I suppose, comfortably laying down on your bed, numb to the outside world, and having a full range of emulated sensory inputs being microwaved into your brain is the way to make this kind of immersive escapism work for the kind of gameplay and time investment an MMO asks of its players. But of course, we are a long, long way from that technology being practical for a consumer level thing, or even any other way, really. But even when more practical things that are actually, properly being worked on right now, like VR bodysuits that have sophisticated haptic feedback and body tracking to boost your level of immersion, I have doubts about this genre being practical with even that technology, because you're still hitting the walls of the other stuff I was talking about, even if it feels more real and even if it feels more responsive. But hey, you know what? When I was a kid, chucking Hadoukens on the Super Nintendo, I don't know if I could have imagined what current gaming looks like, much less what MMOs do on a global scale these days. So I guess we'll see just how fast this technology marches on, and if a developer can find a new, fresh way to do these MMO kind of things, but also make them work in VR in a more practical sense. Does that mean overhauling the systems completely? Does that mean not doing certain things that MMOs typically do? Does that mean redesigning the MMO experience for shorter burst gameplay loops? I don't know. I guess I'll just leave that up to the devs and hope there's someone smarter than me who can figure it out in a practical way, because I do want that. I want to go soak in one of these worlds. Anyway, thanks for watching. I am Blunty. Let me know what you think in the down below, of course, and thank you as always to the patrons scrolling up above. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you next time.